Hi, this is Eric Keller, and this is a short video I made for the question and answer section in 3D World magazine. This question is regarding creating a nice 3D fog for a spooky scene in Maya. And I've created this very simple sort of battlefield scene with the camera pushing through it. It's called Battlefield Start. There are several ways to create fog in Maya. If you want to create a nice wispy fog that a camera can actually move through without any kind of flickering, then your best choice is to use a 3D fluid. And you don't have to make the 3D fluid overcomplicated. You don't have to make it dynamic or anything like that. You can just apply a 3D texture to the fluid effect, and that will create a nice kind of wispy fog. So what I'm going to do is start by switching to the Dynamics menu set. Go to Fluid, Create 3D Container. If I switch to the perspective view, you can see there's the 3D fluid right there, just below the ground. So let me zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to scale this up. Rather than use the scale tool, I'm going to actually use settings in the attribute editor for the 3D fluid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the size to 250 by 50 by 250. So we have sort of a 3D rectangular area, and I'm going to keep voxels square so that the fluid itself does not look distorted when it's rendered. The next thing I'm going to do is go down to the contents method and set the density to gradient and the density gradient to Y gradient, so that's moving up and down along the 3D volume. I'm also going to move this up a little bit. So I found that a Y setting of 20.277 for some reason seems to work well. So I've just translated the 3D volume, the fluid effect, right here itself. So I have fluid 1 selected and set translate Y to 20.277. Let's go to the back of the attribute editor for the fog and continue to start shaping the fog itself. I'm going to leave shaded display to as rendered and set slices per voxel to 12. Since I'm using a texture on the fog itself, it shouldn't take too long to render. I don't need to increase the base resolution because most of the shape of the fog is going to be handled using a 3D texture. So now let's go down to, I can skip a lot of this stuff and just go down to shading. I'm going to set the transparency to close to white so that the fog is nice and thin. I'm going to set the under color input to Y gradient, and I'm going to create a simple gradient that goes from black on the left to white on the right. You can sort of see that as I manipulate this gradient, it's starting to sort of shape the height of the fog. So I'll do something like this. And then another way to shape the fog is to work with the opacity. So I'm going to leave the opacity set to density, and I'm going to create kind of a ramp that goes like this. It goes kind of sharp, upwards sharply. I like to experiment with different shapes to see what happens. But since the input here is density, then this is the opacity determined by the actual density. So as the fog gets denser, which is going to be closer to the bottom, it's going to become more opaque. So the opacity is higher over here. And I'll set this to spline just so it's a nice smooth curve. But while you're working with the fog, you're probably going to want to play with the opacity and the color and experiment with different ways to do the ramp there. You could even get kind of tricky here and add a few bumps. It may not be immediately apparent that that's actually doing anything, but you can experiment with it. Something that's fun to do. Let's do something like that for the moment. And then the most important settings to get the actual shape of the fog is found under textures. I'm going to turn on texture color and texture opacity. When I do that, I might need to adjust this ramp a little bit so that we get something like that. There we go. Camera. So here we go. Now I can actually see the fog. And now I'm going to play with the texture. You can experiment with any of these shapes to create different looks to your fog. I'm just going to use billow, just because I like the way that looks. You can mess with some of these settings to increase the density and so on and so forth. I can just sort of leave it at the default. Another thing you play with is the input bias to make the fog look thicker. This is the input bias on the opacity ramp. And then I'm also going to adjust the frequency. So if I want more detail in the fog, I can increase the frequency. It's going to make the fog more blotchy. Let's do a quick test render and see how it looks. I'm going to store this. That's a little bit too splotchy, so let's decrease the frequency and test render again. And that's starting to look pretty good. So we can continue to adjust the fog. Now the color of the fog that you see is actually coming from the lights interacting with the fog and also the background sphere that I have in there. So the fog is not actually red, it's white, but it's appearing as red because of the way that the lighting is set up. So that's another thing you can experiment with. If you want to animate the fog, you can animate any number of settings to create sort of an effect. One thing, easiest way to do this, of course, is to simply animate the translation of the fog cube itself. So if I have fluid 1 selected, I can actually set keyframes in the translation and have the fog sort of move slowly through the scene. And that works really well. If you want to animate sort of the way that the fog is sort of moving, of course you can combine any of these techniques as well. One thing you can do is set keyframes on texture time. So if I set a keyframe here at 0 and then go to the end of my animation and set this maybe up to let's say 1. Let me switch to the perspective camera so you can sort of see how it's animating. If I press animation, you can sort of see that the fog is sort of churning around there. So usually a good idea to combine moving the fog cube itself with texture time. But other things that you can set keyframes on include things like input bias, if you want the fog to sort of slowly rise up or dissipate. That's another good thing to keyframe. You can even keyframe the positions of each individual marker simply by right-clicking, selecting one of these positions, right-click and choose set key, and then set another key at a different time, and these things will actually move around. And I've even gone sometimes to put expressions on these positions and that kind of stuff, or even the value. So that's something you can try. So there's really no end to the things that you can animate here to create different effects. But that's basically a simple way to create a nice 3D fog in a Maya scene. And when you render the animation, which I will do in a moment, you'll actually see that we're moving through a fog and there's none of that flickering that you would get with like a volume cube. So here's a view of the finished sequence. So probably tweak some of the timing on the churning fog itself, but for the most part you can see that it looks pretty good. The camera moves through it just nicely and there's no like weird flickering artifacts or anything like that. So I hope this has been helpful.